Okay, I am pleased to introduce our speaker today, Ms. Josee Starr, who is Director of Operations at the Mitchell Museum of the American Indian in Evanston. If you haven't been there, you should check it out. Josee is a descendant of the Arikara, Omaha, and Odawa tribes and will share with us the history of the Indigenous people of Chicagoland. Indigenous people have lived in this area since time immemorial and were vital to the formation of Chicagoland as we know it. Josee will discuss the tribes, leaders, and cultures that influence not only Chicagoland's founding, but also make up the thriving Native American community today. Let's give a warm welcome to Josee.
Hello, Ani Buju. Good morning, everyone. Hello, Ani and Buju. You say hello in the Odawa Anishinaabe language. Ani is the Ojibwe version of it. Buju is the Potawatomi or Bodawatomi version of hello. Good morning, Mino Gajup. Again, my name is Josee Starr. I work at the Mitchell Museum of the American Indian. We are located, thank you, Judy. I'm so glad to have met you and to be here with you guys today. I'm going to get started with reading out our land acknowledgement. The land that the Mitchell Museum occupies today is the unceded ancestral homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. More than a dozen other nations called this region of northeastern Illinois home, including the Menominee, the Oto, the Missouri, the Iowas, the Winnebago Ho-Chunks, the Meskwaki, Sauk, Miami, Wea, Piankashaw, Kickapoo, and Illini Confederacy. Long before European contact, this region was a place of great significance for transportation, agriculture, trade, and commerce for many Indigenous communities throughout the Great Lakes. The innovation of these Indigenous communities and the complex infrastructure they developed served as a blueprint for Chicago to grow and become the major metropolis that we live in now. Despite the forced removal, displacement, and oppression of the original inhabitants of this land, Chicago is still home to one of the country's largest Native communities, representing over 150 Indigenous nations across North America. The presence of Chicago's thriving Indigenous community today is a testament to their enduring strength, determination, and resilience. The Mitchell Museum honors the survival and perseverance of Indigenous communities. We are committed to promoting a greater understanding of Indigenous peoples and serving as a space to celebrate their diverse cultures, rich histories, and present-day experiences and contributions. So a little bit about myself, and Judy did a wonderful introduction. On my father's side, I am enrolled in the Fort Berthold tribe of North Dakota, known as the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara nations, or the three affiliated tribes of North Dakota. I am first generation urban-born Native, meaning my father was born on the reservation and raised. I was born here in Chicago. On my mom's side, I am Omaha from Macy, Nebraska, and Odawa from Akwamkong, Ontario. I am a second generation urban-born Native on my mother's side, meaning my grandparents were born on their reservations and my mom was born in the Chicago Native community, which I'll get into a little bit later towards the later in the presentation. And again, this is a discussion, this is an open conversation with you all. So as I'm talking and going through some of the subjects, because I'm going to fly through this presentation, there's a lot to cover in just an hour of time to talk with you all. So I'm going to shorten up my own presentation. Again, I do work at the Mitchell Museum. I'm there Monday through Friday. Judy always knows how to find me over at the museum. You're always more than welcome to come and visit us over at the museum. About the Mitchell Museum. So our mission is to promote and share a deeper understanding of cultures of American Indian people. We're one of only a handful of museums across the country that focuses exclusively on the art, history, culture, and current events of American Indian and First Nation peoples from throughout the United States and Canada. So sorry. Our museum was founded in 1977 by John and Betty Seabury Mitchell with the donation of 3,000 of their items. We started out under Kendall College. We moved to our current location on the corner of Central and Central Park in 2003. We became our own nonprofit in 2006. Currently today, our collection sits at over 10,000 items. We average about 10,000 visitors per year. That was pre-COVID numbers. We've now reopened, and I believe we have exceeded 10,000 visitors per year through our programs and our school tours that we offer. We're a small staff. There are 3 full-time and 3 part-time staff members moving the museum along. We work to promote the visibility and impacts of American Indians through cultural preservation. Most often, Native people are only spoken about in the past, and we are often doing the work to help talk about today's Native community. The museum covers the Native people of the United States and Canada. We do not include talking about the Native Hawaiians, although we do work with the community, the Native Hawaiian community here in Chicago to do cross-cultural programs, but our museum focuses on the Indigenous peoples of the United States and Canada. Currently, there are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States alone, including 229 tribes in Alaska. The last tribe to be recognized is the Little Shell in Montana in December of 2019. The other federally recognized tribes are located in 33 other states. Additionally, there are state recognized tribes located throughout the United States, recognized by their respective state governments and not recognized by the federal government. Tribes are governments. Tribes are their own sovereign nations, and there's supposed to be a government-to-government relationship with the federal government. This here is a map that shows the reservation lands just here in the United States. And you can see that there are no tribal lands located in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky. And here's a closer up view of the Midwest. Michigan and Wisconsin do still have tribal lands. Iowa has one reservation. Kansas also has like 4 reservations. The state of Oklahoma became what was known as Indian Territory during the removal period. And there are currently, I believe it's 33 tribal nations that are located in Oklahoma. And most of those tribes, their original homelands are located across the United States. This is just a brief timeline of federal policy towards Native people. 1492, when we were discovered by Christopher Columbus. 1492 to 1828 is the colonial period. 1828 to 1887 is the removal, reservation, and treaty period. 1887 to 1934 is allotment and assimilation period. The Indian reorganization period is 1934 to 1945. 1945 to 1968, termination and relocation period. And we are currently in our self-determination period from 1968 to today, and this will be ongoing. Some other significant dates to note about federal policy towards Natives while this slide is up is talking about Indian boarding schools and residential schools. Because Canada and the United States both had residential schools and boarding schools. Beginning with the Indian Civilization Act Fund of March 3rd, 1819, and the Peace Policy of 1869, the United States, in concert with and at the urging of several denominations of the Christian Church, adopted an Indian boarding school policy expressly intended to implement cultural genocide through the removal and reprogramming of American Indian and Alaska Native children to accomplish the systematic destruction of Native cultures and communities. The stated purpose of this policy was to kill the Indian and save the man. Between 1869 and the 1960s, hundreds of thousands of Native American children were removed from their homes and families and placed in boarding schools operated by the federal government and the churches. Though we don't know how many children were taken in total, by 1900, there were about 20,000 children in Indian boarding schools, and by 1925, that number had more than tripled. More information and resource about this movement to bring light and awareness to is the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. They host programs, and they talk about, they also have a lot of resources available to talk about what happened here in the United States. Deb Holland is currently leading a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to talk about the families that have all been affected by this, and that's here in the United States. In Canada, they had what was called residential schools. The Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, the largest class action settlement in Canadian history, began to be implemented in 2007. One of the elements of the agreement was the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada to facilitate reconciliation among former students, their families, their communities, and all Canadians. A National Truth and Reconciliation Commission declared in 2015 that the schools, which operated from 1883 to 1996, were a form of cultural genocide. And during COVID, they were going through the school grounds, and this is just a quote from an article that came out August 1st, 2021. The recent discoveries of more than 1,300 unmarked graves at the sites of 4 former residential schools in Western Canada have shocked and horrified Canadians. That was just from 4 schools. Yes.
What did they do to relocate children to the schools? Did they go to their houses and pick them up or what?
Yes, it was forced removal. My grandmother went through boarding school. My grandfather went through residential schools in Canada. The families had no say of whether the children were to go to the boarding schools. The churches and the government came in and forcefully removed children as young as 4 years old and placed them into these residential boarding schools. Most of the times they were held within pretty close to where their reservation lands were. And then the students were then running away and still trying to get back home. And the ones that were the runners were then sent further away. One of the largest, most well-known schools here in the United States was the Carlisle Indian Boarding School in Pennsylvania. Most of the students there came from the Dakotas and the Plains regions because they pushed the kids further away so it would be harder for them to get back home. My grandfather went to a boarding school in Spanish, Ontario, not too far away from where his reservation was. My grandmother went to boarding school in Kansas. She was sent over there. And the first thing that they did when the students were placed into these boarding schools, they had their haircuts and they were removed of everything that they have grown up knowing. They were beaten for speaking their language and forced to speak English by the nuns. My grandmother, once she left the reservation after she went through boarding school, she was taught it was bad to be a Native person, to be who she is. So she never went back to her reservation. I don't know that side of my family because of this history. So after she left school, she joined the Army. She was a nurse in World War II. And then she came to Chicago because she already had some family that was living here. And my grandmother and my grandfather also came to Chicago looking for work in the 1950s.
Josee, let me remind people how they can ask questions and how everyone will be able to hear all the questions on Zoom as well as in the auditorium. If you have a question, Josee's fine with you interrupting her to raise your hand. When you raise your hand, Ernie will come and bring a microphone to you. We'll all be able to hear the question, and then Josee will respond. So thank you, Josee. I think we're happy to handle it that way.
Okay, thank you. I did forget. No problem. Thank you. Yes, we got one other question here.
In the boarding schools, are the children were the orphans, or were they given families? You said this that your grandmother had a family in Chicago. Were they adopted out?
It was her own brothers and sisters that were living here that she was born with. They did go to, some of them did go to the same boarding school. Some of them also were removed and sent to different boarding schools to separate the families. But she had kept in contact with a couple brothers, and because they also went in and were in World War II. They were both stationed in Germany, but they ended up moving to Chicago, and they found each other after. They kept in contact through all of that. No, they were not given adopted families. Up in Canada in 1960s, there was another policy that was in place by the federal government that it was called the 60s Scoop. And that is again where the federal government of Canada went in onto the reservations and forcefully removed children and adopted them out to non-native families, most of them here in the United States, and all records were lost. So those families are still looking for the connection of where they came from in Canada. Most of the times they can find a general area of where their family is from, but they are still searching for what actual reservation they are. So they know their tribal nation, they just don't know which band or reserve that they're from. Other important dates to note while this map is up, Native Americans were not granted citizenship to become US citizens until June 2nd, 1924. I remember that date specifically because my grandmother was born June 2nd, 1923. So she was a year old when even though she was born just off of the reservation, she didn't become a US citizen until she was a year old. Native Americans were not granted the right to vote in every state until 1962. And in 1978, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed to protect the rights of Native Americans to exercise their traditional religions by ensuring access to sites, use and possession of sacred objects, and the freedom to worship through ceremonials and traditional rites. It was illegal for us to continue practicing our cultural traditions until 1978, when we were granted the right to be able to do that openly and freely without fear of prosecution. A little bit about Native Americans in Illinois. And again, I'm just going to go back to the first paragraph of our land acknowledgement that we have. The way that we wrote it is we include the traditional names of the tribal nations represented here in the Chicagoland area, both their own traditional names of what they call themselves and the English versions of that. I can mostly pronounce just the English versions. I can pronounce some of the tribal names of the original tribes that were from this area. The land that the Mitchell Museum occupies today is the unceded ancestral homelands, the Council of the Three Fires, the Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe, Odawa, or Ottawa, and Potawatomi or Potawatomi nations, and more than a dozen other nations called the region of northeastern Illinois home, including the Menominee, the Oto, the Missouri, Iowas, Winnebago Ho-Chunks, Meskwakis, Sauk, Miami, Wea, Piankashaw, Kickapoo, and Illini Confederacy. Some significant treaties to talk about when we're talking about the Chicagoland area is the Greenville Treaty of 1795 that established military posts throughout the upper Midwest, including Fort Dearborn, and the 1833 Treaty of Chicago granted the US government the legal authority to seize the remaining Indian lands in Illinois. Some other what directly came out of the Treaty of Chicago and some of the other treaties that were getting signed through the removal period in 1830s here in Illinois. Most people, when you're taught history of Native people, you hear about the Trail of Tears of the Cherokee through the southeast part of the United States and into Oklahoma. Here in our area, we have what is known the Potawatomi Trail of Death, was the forced removal by militia in 1838 of about 859 members of the Potawatomi Nation from Indiana to reservation lands in what is now eastern Kansas. And another significant thing to note, most of the founders of the cities around the Chicagoland area, they had Potawatomi wives, and it was their Potawatomi wives that allowed them to be known as the first established permanent resident of these areas, because Native people have lived in these lands since time immemorial. A lot of our creation stories put us in this area or have lived around in the Chicagoland area specifically, which is why there are about 12 different tribal nations we list in our land acknowledgements, because some of the tribal nations that have been here, even though in their own history through time, they might have been here in the Chicagoland, they were still here for generations, for hundreds of years, even though if you look across their timeline of their tribal nation, they would have only been here for a few hundred years.
Josee, I have a question.
Yes.
My daughter and I have found scrapers and Indian heads in the Skokie Lagoons area. Now we know that the Skokie Lagoons was changed during the 30s to what it is now. But obviously prior to that, what Native Americans might have been in that specific area of the Skokie Lagoons?
It was a predominantly Potawatomi area in this area, but that's another thing to note is especially when we're talking about land acknowledgements, or a lot of the questions we get when people come to the museum or to us specifically asking for help in writing a land acknowledgement. We make sure to include or talk about land ownership. Native people do not, because we still also believe this, do not think of land ownership in the same way that the Europeans thought of when they came over here. We do not have the hard lines of boundary lines. So when you're talking about like tribal nations that are originally in an area, we're looking over the course of hundreds of years of those that lived in an area. We're not looking at just one specific time. So Menominees also might have spent a small amount of their time in the Skokie Lagoons area, as well as some of the other Potawatomis, Winnebagos, and Ho-Chunks. Yes.
We want everyone to hear your question, so
Hello. I just want to know, do you happen to know where the name Chicago and the name Illinois came from?
Yeah, the name Illinois actually came from a tribal people, the Illini, and Chicago came from, there's different versions of it through each one of these tribal nations that were originally here. And most of them, like one of the tribal nations have originally called the Chicagoland area as Chicago or Chicago, because those all roughly translate to land of the stinky onions, or the place that smelled like wild onions, because that's what abundantly grew in the Chicagoland area. So Chicago's name specifically came from some tribal nations, from what they called the area. There's another question.
I think I heard you say that children were forcibly removed from their homes and brought into religious education. What kind of justification did the religious people have for forcibly removing children from their home and indoctrinating them into this new way of thinking?
That's the question that we've been asking since it happened. Why did they feel the need to come in and force English and everything? They wanted us to be mainstreamed into speaking English and to lose our cultural ways. And I will get into a little bit more of it later when talking about specifically like cultural genocide, which is what that was. It was forcing them to lose their language and their culture. Our languages, several languages have been lost because of these acts of forcing the children to be able to remove that.
I understand that it was cultural genocide. What I'm having a hard time wrapping my mind around is they must have had some kind of justification within their own heads, within their own religious ethics, something that they had allowed them to do that.
It wasn't
I have
just-
no
it
idea
wasn't
what
just
that
the-
was.
It was also coming from the federal government, from the US armies. We're also helping to round up all of the kids. And this also came at the same time when a lot of the tribal nations were getting removed from their original areas. The treaties were getting signed and pushing them onto reservations. And once the tribal nations were pushed onto reservations, they were not allowed to leave those reservations. And the reservation lands that they were given by signing away most of like the Chicagoland or entire state of Illinois, most of what they were then pushed onto these reservations, and the reservation lands that they were given were areas that nothing was meant to grow. That we couldn't leave, that we couldn't grow or continue living the way that we were, and you were prosecuted and shot for leaving your reservation if you even attempted to. You had to get permission from the federal government to even leave the reservations. And once tribal nations started getting put on the reservations, there became a role that developed out of this. One of them is the Dawes role. And today, we still all as Native people, and when I started out with my introduction talking about how I was enrolled in a federally recognized tribe, Native people are the only people that have to prove our bloodlines to be able to be enrolled in a tribal nation. We still have to prove that we are, and it's mandated by the federal government, to prove that you are 25%. Usually that's the minimum of most tribal nations. You have to be 25% and prove your bloodlines, and they go back onto these roles when they started pushing them onto the reservations. So a lot of us Native people, we can rattle off, we have our family trees that go back 10, 20 generations, because we have to be able to show this and bring it down to prove our bloodlines, to even legally claim that we are a Native person belonging to a tribal nation. My mom did try to enroll me into the Omaha tribe, into the tribe she's enrolled with my grandmother. But through intermarrying, I think it's about 7 generations ago, on that side of the family, there was a French fur trader, a relative of ours had married. So that carried down. I am 24.9%. So I was unable to be enrolled in the Omaha Nation. So I can only claim descendancy of the Omaha people. I am not able to be a tribal citizen of that band. So I'm enrolled, that's why I'm enrolled on my father's side, which I am 49.5% because of a French fur trader along that side of the family. So I'm just shy of being 50%. And that's something that we as Native people have to look at when we are thinking of our future bloodlines, of wanting to make sure that our children are enrolled to be able to. So that's something that does happen when Native people are thinking about their future generations, is if you marry a non-Native person, whatever your bloodline is, that's where it ends. So, and that's one of the other things that's going on today across the country, is trying to push back against, because this is federal policy. It's built right into the treaties that were signed with the tribal nations, was about blood quantum. I know some tribal nations are trying to push back against it as best they can. The Ho-Chunks just recently at their general council meeting had voted to have anybody born after, I can't remember the exact date, but I know they just made a motion and it's going through their process and their tribal government. But anybody born after like 1950 is now considered full blood. So they're trying to restart their blood quantum, because we can't move away from the blood quantum that's written into the treaties with the federal government. But they're trying to figure out a way to creatively, because we're looking at it now, and 2 generations, 3 generations, the tribal nations, the numbers are starting to go down, and they're trying to figure out a way to be able to keep their tribal citizens, the numbers up. So another federal policy to talk about is the Relocation Act of 1953 and Relocation Act of 1956.
Excuse
Oh,
me.
question, yes.
To the gentleman that wanted to know what justification the churches had for grabbing the children, I think it's the same thing that's been going on, not just in America, but all across Europe. The Christianity or Catholic churches, they all felt, especially back then, that they were saving your soul. If you didn't believe their faith, then when you died, you went to hell, I guess. And so they felt they were doing a good thing. And as far as the government, what was their motivation? They had been warring with all these tribes because of colonialization. And so they made treaties and they got federal benefits for going on these reservations. And when you talk about, well, you have to have 25% proven blood, I think that's in order to get these benefits from the federal government.
There's not a lot of benefits, and not one treaty that has ever been signed with a tribal nation has ever been fully honored.
Yes, I believe that too. And also these reservations that have casinos and stuff, don't they split their profits with the natives according to whether or not they have so much?
Some do, and that goes into the tribal sovereignty and the that's the purpose or the reason for. So a lot of times when they were put onto these reservations, they're in remote areas, there's not a lot going on there. They have to be able to find a way to be self-sustainable, to have their own, to be able to move their own government, because they're their own nation. And casinos sometimes are what they end up doing, because they can do that. They're allowed to do that on their own lands to be able to do that. And the ones that are successful, they do share some of the profits. Not all tribes do that. Not every single tribal person receives benefits from being an enrolled member of a tribal nation. Some tribes do allow that.
Josee, just some housekeeping. We have lots of hands up, so this may derail you, but I know that you're here to answer questions, so that will be good. We also have a deadline of having to be done by 11:30 because the pizza comes at that time.
Yep.
So we're going to go back and forth with the microphone. I have a gentleman here with a question.
Okay.
Then we'll go to Arnie and he'll pick one, and we're going to continue like that.
Yeah, I am keeping an eye on the
Let's try to have
Thank you.
questions that are concise and that are really questions. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. My father his mother was half American Indian, so I don't know what percentage that makes me, but I've read a lot about American Indians. I read this recent book. It's called The Indigenous Continent by an Oxford historian. It was quite an interesting book. But one of the things that the book emphasized was a couple of things. Was the Indians were driven off beyond the Mississippi River by in the 1830s, weren't they? I mean, there was no Indians. There might have been somebody who was a percentage Indian, like a wife who had a white husband, but most of the Indians were pushed beyond the Mississippi River back in the 1830s, correct?
Yes.
1830s or 40s. So
The treaties around this area, yes.
yeah, and for instance, the Fox River, there's a famous monument along the Fox River, or along the Rock River of Black Hawk, the Fox chief, who would come back into who would slip back into Illinois once in a while, trying to evade the treaties,
Yep.
and was driven back by Lincoln. Was one of the but militias who would drive the Indians back across the Mississippi from time to time.
Mhm.
But that was just that's the reason there aren't any reservations in Illinois or in Indiana.
Removal, yeah, but there is one tribal nation today that's still fighting to get their land back, and that is the Prairie Band of Potawatomi. Their tribal reservation lands now are in Kansas. When they were removed from the area, they were pushed down into Kansas. They're one of the 4 tribal nations in Kansas. Today, they are still fighting to get recognition, to be federally recognized here in Illinois. They have purchased their land back because it's not going to be given back to them, so they bought it. And it's out in DeKalb. They're in the Supreme Court today fighting to get federal recognition back. And I'm not going to say if, I've stopped saying if, I'm going to say when. When they get their recognition back, they will be the first tribal nation with lands back here in Illinois. Indiana currently has one tribal nation, and that is the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi. Pokagon Band of Potawatomi have their lands in southwestern Michigan and just north of South Bend. They do have tribal lands in Indiana, but the Pokagons, they were one of the tribes that resisted the removal. They did start to go out, but then they went back and they stayed permanently settled in the southwestern part of Michigan. They fought for their federal recognition back, and they didn't get their federal recognition back until 1991. Fairly recently, not that long ago. So they are one of the tribes. So it can happen, and I am fully believing that it will happen here in Illinois for the Prairie Band of Potawatomi. We've got another question.
I'm standing up for another question. I'm wondering about the position of American Indians with the United States.
Sure.
For instance, do they serve in the army? Do
Yes,
they pay taxes?
yes,
And do they vote?
yes. We vote in two elections because we are citizens of two different nations. We're citizens of the United States and we are citizens of our own tribal nations. So we vote in two different elections. We watch two different government voting systems that go on. Native Americans have served per capita the highest number of people serving in the military, and there are exhibitions. The Trickster Cultural Center out in Schaumburg actually serves Native veterans. Native veterans were serving with the U.S. Army before they were even legally citizens of the United States. So we do pay taxes. We have a whole exhibit. There's a traveling exhibit that we have at the Mitchell Museum called Indigifacts, and it addresses a lot of these questions that you guys are asking today. It's about 10 panels that talks about a lot about the myths, and it just gives a lot of information about Native people. So a lot of these questions, and I will try to follow up with Judy to see if we can get that here to be able to show you guys this traveling exhibit that we have.
If you can continue now.
Okay, wait, we got one more question.
Years ago, in the sixties. Years ago in the sixties, I worked for this insurance man, and he sent calendars, yearly at the end of every year to his clients, and they were made by the Blackfeet Indians, I believe, of Montana. Does that ring a bell with you?
Blackfeet are located out in Montana, and I'm going to get right now into talking about our current Native. So I might be able to ask your questions. If not, once I get through this next part of the presentation,
okay.
I'm going to come back to you after this next part of the presentation. Okay. Jumping and fast forwarding now to the Indian Relocation Resolution in 1953 and the Relocation Act of 1956, which is how our Chicago Native community was started today. There were 5 cities that were chosen through this federal policy. Chicago was one of them. San Francisco was another one. Denver, New York, Los Angeles. There were 5 cities that were chosen, and the federal government actively recruited American Indians to leave reservations to help with war and post-war efforts in these cities, which was another further assimilation effort to bring natives into mainstream urban areas. Sadly, natives were drawn to these cities under false pretenses because what was promised, they went onto the reservations with their marketing materials to talk about. And one of the things they promised better lives, better jobs for your families. So the families were signing up and coming in by the busloads. They were bringing Native people in from reservations, not just like in the Midwest, from around the United States, and bringing them in by the busloads. There was one office here in the Chicago area located downtown that was run by the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And the goal was to get them into the Chicagoland area to get good jobs. Chicago was usually just the one main hub for it. A lot of times they were then pushed out into some of the suburbs in this area, like Aurora and Joliet and Gary, Indiana, or Chicago was just the changing station for some of them, and they were going into other cities like Detroit. My dad's side of the family, they came down here through the Relocation Act and in the 1950s, and they were supposed to end up in Detroit. They stopped here in Chicago to change the buses. He had a cousin that was living here, and he's decided to stop and visit, and then they just never left the Chicagoland area. So they grew up out in one of the suburbs. My father actually graduated high school from one of the suburbs out here outside of Chicago. But in 1953, as these families were getting brought in, most of the families were coming down with like 6 kids, 7 kids, 10 kids, and they were getting placed into temporary housing, which was usually hotels. And then they were getting left there for a year. There was never any housing that was opening for them. And a lot of the stuff, again, that was promised to the families that weren't in place. Our community that was coming in the first waves of the buses, or the ones that had already been here previously, they knew nothing was in place for the ones that were going to be coming in. So they would go down to the bus stop. They were learning the bus routes, and they were actively finding and helping their own family or Native people that were coming in. The main area that Native people ended up settling in the Chicagoland area in the 1950s were in the Uptown neighborhood. In 1953, that is when our American Indian Center was formed. The American Indian Center of Chicago is the oldest continuously run Indian center in the country. My grandparents on my mom's side were two of the founding members of the American Indian Center of Chicago. So I grew up hearing the stories specifically about the Chicago Native community, why the American Indian Center was even needed, because with the large influx of Native people coming into the Chicagoland area, they still needed a place to be able to gather, to talk, because they were already gathering in each other's front living rooms, they were gathering in parks, finding places just to be able to be together, to host community picnics and community celebrations. That's how the American Indian Center was born, to be able to come about and do that. And it became a social service. In the 1980s, there were over 30 different Native organizations across the city and suburbs. And today, there are currently 18 different Native organizations across the city and suburbs. 17 of them are a part of what is called the Chicago American Indian Community Collaborative. And we host a lot of different events. We still actively, and it's a lot harder for us here in urban settings to be able to still be culturally involved because we are so far removed from our own tribal nations, and we're living here in such a huge melting pot. I consider it a benefit to have grown up in the Chicago Native community because I not only grew up learning my own traditional cultural ways, I was learning from some of our elders who were Lakota and some of the elders who were Dene or Navajo. So I have been learning a little bit about all of these different tribal nations from our own community that are represented here. In 2020, the American Indian Alaska Native alone population accounted for 1.1% of all people living in the United States. There are 139,300 living in Illinois. 97% of them reside in Cook County in the greater Chicagoland area. This is to talk about, we call it CAIC, C-A-I-C-C. They do have a website. They do promote a lot of our organizations. The Mitchell Museum does sit on as one of these member organizations. The Trickster Cultural Center out in Schaumburg also sits on as another organization. They do a lot for Native veterans. They have their own exhibits to talk about specifically the Native veterans, because I know that was one of the questions that was asked earlier. I'm going to fast forward through CAIC because you guys can always come and find me. I know we're coming up on time and I know there's still some more questions coming through. But at its core, CAIC was just created so that we could be able to align all of our Native organizations to still continue serving the Native population, but also to talk about how to educate about Native people here in the Chicagoland area. Facts and figures. Half of Native Americans in Chicago are burdened paying more than 30% of their income in rent. Native Americans are almost twice as likely to be denied a home loan as whites after accounting for the gender of the applicant, presence of a co-applicant, loan amount, income, and neighborhood. Native Americans are less likely than whites to have a college degree. The wage increase associated with a college degree is lower for Native Americans than that of all other race groups in Chicago. Just over 1,000 Native Americans are presently enrolled in Chicago public schools. Research suggests that CPS may be neglecting the particular needs of these students in terms of test preparation and college readiness. Native Americans in Chicago have higher levels of unemployment and lower median household income than whites in the city. Native Americans are paid 20% less than similarly positioned whites in Chicago, and the racial wage gap is similar to that of Black residents and larger than that experienced by Latinx and Asian American residents. There is another federal policy to talk about just briefly. In 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act, also known as ICWA, was enacted into federal law by the House and Senate and signed into law by President of the United States, Jimmy Carter. ICWA was created to safeguard Native American children from unlawful removal or adoptions by non-Native American agencies or families. And it is honored here in Illinois. In 2015, Governor Pat Quinn, the state of Illinois governor, signed an executive order establishing the ICWA Council, who helps administer the lawful enforcement of ICWA law here in Illinois. It's a lot of teaching for us to be able to talk about ICWA, and the reason for the founding of ICWA was to keep Native students with Native families, to be able to keep the culture moving forward and to move away from our traumatic past of forced removal and being forced into forgetting our own culture. In 2015, the ICWA Council works hand in hand with the State of Illinois Department of Human Services to ensure proper compliance and bring issues of accountability to the leadership. In 2021, the ICWA was responsible to successfully negotiate 2 ICWA specialist positions in DHS to ensure day-to-day compliance. It's only 2 people in the entire state of Illinois to work with all of the Native students or Native children that are going through the system right now. So Native Americans or American Indian, what is the correct term? Because I've been going back and forth. Through both throughout the entire presentation. Native American and American Indian, the American Indian is on its way out. It's no longer appropriate to be called American Indian, but and I'm also finding that it is a generational term. My mom's generation and older all still go by American Indian because that is what was forced upon us since 1492, being called Indian or American Indian. And it's built right into a lot of the federal government agencies that were created to deal with the Indian problem, like the BIA. The terms that are now correct would be Native American, Indigenous, or talking to the Native person you're talking to and asking what they would like to be referred to, because most of us go by our own tribal nations that we talk about, and that is the best way, is just open a conversation with the person you're talking to ask them what is the correct term. I'm going to fast forward through this part of it because I do want to make sure you guys make your pizza party. Want to learn more? We are located just down the street in Evanston. We're like maybe 10 minutes from here. We're open from 10 to 5. We are open Saturdays from 10 to 3. We have a virtual tour you can take at the museum. There is another virtual tour that you could take that's sponsored by Northwestern University. That is located right on their website. Talks a lot about, it's an interactive map. There's a mini documentary that you can watch. It's a free 6-minute mini documentary that's right on the CAKE website, the Chicago American Indian Community Collaborative website. It explores local Indigenous history of Chicago. And there's a book. This is just one book. There's a lot of different books that you could read, but the imprints, the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians in the city of Chicago, examines the way that Pokagon Potawatomi tribal members kept their distinct Native identity in the midst of a larger contemporary society.
That's the powwows that are conducted here in the Chicagoland area, which I've attended myself with my wife. Could you talk about the function and sponsorship and the occurrence of those powwows that are conducted here locally?
Yeah, so powwows are celebrations, and Chicago actually has the longest continuously run urban powwow, which is sponsored by the American Indian Center. They are having their 70th annual powwow, but a lot of our organizations do sponsor powwows. There was just another one that the American Indian Health Services of Chicago just sponsored in the end of September, and for awareness of, it's called Orange Shirt Day, but it's to talk about residential school and boarding school survivors. So that powwow is to not only highlight the day of Orange Shirt Day, but that was held out at Bunker Hill at the end of September. All of you can find information, powwows are open. If we post about it, you guys are more than welcome to come and attend. But if you follow the CAKE website or go onto their events page, you can see a lot of the powwows that are coming up. I do share some of them out in our newsletter at the museum just to keep people engaged. Northwestern University has their student-run powwow. They've hosted their 2nd annual. They're planning their 3rd annual powwow. In the entire history of Northwestern University, they're only on their 3rd annual powwow. And it was a huge push and win for the Native students to be able to do that. So it's held at their basketball arena, usually held in the spring. You guys are more than welcome to attend that also. Some other resources, just real quick, if you guys are on Facebook or Instagram, not only our at the museum, our social media, but Illuminative and Red House Series are two social media pages I highly encourage you to follow if you want to keep aware of what's going on in what's called Indian country and what's going on with Native people in the United States and Canada. These two I highly recommend, and they go right along with the theme months of Women's History Month, and they'll highlight a lot of our own Native Indigenous women, the leaders. They highly recommend following those ones. Okay, so
Yes, first of all, I want to say what a terrific presentation. I want to learn more when we're going to the museum. But you mentioned lots of tribes. Are there commonalities in the way their culture or the way they do things, or are they all different? You know, what's common and what's different between the tribes?
most of that is regional. So again, here in the United States, and we do have a great exhibit at this at the museum, Regional Tour of American Indian Cultures. It takes you through the 5 regions. But most tribal nations within one region, a lot of them will have a lot of similarities. But again, here in the United States, 574 federally recognized tribes. That's over 150 different tribal languages that are spoken alone here in the United States. That's not including the First Nations people of Canada. So here in the Great Lakes area, the Woodlands region, a lot of it is Anishinaabe or Menominee. A lot of our design work that we do is the floral design that you see on the edge of the presentation. The Plains region, a lot of those tribal nations are going to be very similar, but they're completely different than the Woodlands people. And then same thing with the Southwest Native people. A lot of their designs and color and there's a lot of similarities in their own cultures there in the Southwest, but they're completely different than the Plains and the Woodlands region. You're more than welcome to come to the museum to see our exhibits, and we could talk about this. We can work on coordinating a tour maybe with Judy if you guys want to come and visit our museum. We do have about 6 different docents that do a tour to talk about a lot of the things that we have on display in our main exhibition.
Josee, there's a question on Zoom.
Yes.
If you can, let me read. What parallels can be drawn between the treatment of Indians in the United States and the separation of families of immigrants at our southern border and the Russian cultural genocide of the Ukrainians as far as ethnic cleansing and war crimes? Do you have an hour to answer that?
That is a very good question. There are a lot of similarities that I'm seeing. So one thing that I do end up pointing out in a lot of presentations that I do is Native people, our stories seem to align a lot with those of other immigrants, like what's going on today with the large influx of immigrants that are coming in looking for better lives. Except this is my own personal belief, don't bring this back in the museum, but the influx, I still don't fully believe that the federal government's not out in South America and Mexico promising the same thing that was promised to Native people here, which was through the Relocation Act, the 1950s, because this is all very similar to what we've seen in the 1950s going on across the United States, just on federal tribal nations.
Raise your hand if you have a question. I've got a mic. All right, let me give it to you first, ma'am.
Thank you. I'm aware that in northern Wisconsin, the pipeline that's going through the Indian reservation is in the courts.
Mm-hmm.
And how much are the treaties protecting reservations from our government insurgents? Nothing.
They're
They
not
have the right to do this.
Yeah, there's a huge fight, and pipelines is a whole other issue that we could spend another hour talking about. But pipelines are something, and that's something that they're fighting about. I know Standing Rock, if there's a lot of documentaries I was talking about Standing Rock, which was just several years ago, talking about the fight against keeping pipelines out of tribal lands, which is right where the oil companies want to send them through. They want to keep them out of their larger cities. So their bright idea is to put them right through the reservations. The Native people are fighting against it.
Josee, would you mind defining what the term nation involves?
For the tribal nations?
Yes, for example, in Wisconsin, we have a lot of reservations. I don't know if we have any nations. In the Southwest and Arizona, you have the the tribal nations, and I'm confused as to what the term nation implies. What are the benefits?
They are each, every single one of them is a nation. Every single reservation is a nation. Of some of the tribal names, some of the tribal governments do not have the word nation within their name, but they are nations. And that's part of what I talked about at the beginning of the presentation, tribal sovereignty and a nation to nation respect between the US government and the tribal nations. But every single tribal nation that has the reservation land, they are tribal nations, which they are their own government. They have their own jurisdiction, legislature. They have their own laws that they follow. Okay. Okay.
So I was just wondering if there was any political representation in the city of Chicago for any of the tribes, you know, anybody on the council or anything like that.
Here in Illinois, because there are no tribal nations or recognized tribal nation lands here in Illinois, that's why we have our organizations to be able to survive in a place like Illinois. We have we had to develop the nonprofits. That's what the American Indian Center, that's what the CAKE is, and the collaborative. That's what we use to help our voice to be able to go out and do things in the state of Illinois. And a lot of it is teaching about Native people, tribal laws. It doesn't exactly fit to us either here living in a city. So just recently, and I can spend another hour talking about this, is there were 3 pieces of legislation just signed this year alone. On Friday, August 3rd, Governor Pritzker signed 3 new laws into effect directly that came out of the work of CAKE, the Chicago American Indian Community Collaborative. One of them is an education bill that will now mandate the updating of teaching how Native people are taught in schools K through 12. There's another there's some more work going on with the State Board of Education to create a resource curriculum guide that will go out to the teachers to help the teachers talk about, because most times when Native people in curriculum are taught, they only go up until the 1830s and they don't talk about the tribal nations today. They don't talk about the tribal nations and what it actually means. They don't talk about tribal sovereignty. All of that is coming. It was just signed into law just a few months ago. And our education committee at CAKE, and I was one of the ones helping do some of this work to be able to go in and talk about and how we're going to do and teach the teachers. That was just one bill that was signed. There's another one that was a regalia bill that will allow Native students to be able to wear their traditional clothing and a lot of what we do, feathers, and on graduation days, because there was a student in Evanston Township High School that was denied being able to walk because he had traditional clothing on and it didn't fit with the uniform. So he was told as he was just about to go up on stage to go get his stuff. And the teacher pulled him aside and told him, take off all your stuff or you're not going to walk. And he chose not to walk because it was made by our community. It was made by elders. Everything that was given to him was made and created and gifted for him for his accomplishment of graduating. So he went on, his mom also went on, and they got a bill now passed here in Illinois. So it will not happen to another Native student here in Illinois. These bills have already been passed in other states. And there's another bill, the third one's about repatriation, that's specifically talking about museums. And those are just 3 of the bills that were signed. And it's been the education one we never thought would happen here in Illinois. And it was a huge accomplishment and win for us, especially because we are fighting to even be seen, since we are only like 1% of the population.
This is the self-determination period. What are you determining?
It's determining who we are to teach and educate people about Native people and to talk about, and because most people, when they think of Native people, they think that we are one person, but we are not. We're only 574 federal. That's just the ones that are federally recognized. There are still more tribal nations looking to get their federal recognition back because it was taken from them so long ago. But to be able to teach and educate so that we can continue our culture and tradition and keep our languages alive.
Josee, a personal question.
Yes.
But I think everyone would be interested. What's the biggest misunderstanding we may have about Native Americans?
that we are not all one tribal nation. We are not one. We all don't have the same language. We don't celebrate the same holidays or the same ceremonies. We are so different from each other that even for us as Native people, would take a lifetime to learn about other tribal nations.
Josee, it's been wonderful. There's much more. We'll probably have to have you back. So thank you.